Hey there, players of all classes. Today, we're back with another Supplementals, and I want to talk to you about a supplement called the Gemhammer Grimoire. I looked over there to make sure that it was on the camera so that you could read it. But this is the Gemhammer Grimoire. This is from Gemhammer & Sons Gaming. More better game stuff. And before I even get into the book as a whole, I want to say thank you to a fellow DM, XO Clubs, who DM'd a game for me way back when. And when I first started DMing, he had this huge collection of stuff that he kickstarted and collected over the years for 5e. He was sort of getting out of 5e, and he wanted to sort of downsize his physical collection, so he just gave away all the stuff. I had never heard of anything that these guys did. I have this now. A bunch of people in my group got many, many books from him. He's just an overall awesome dude, and I'm hoping at some point when we get to more system agnostic stuff for DM Roundtable that he will come and join us, because he doesn't really care about 5e anymore, or 5.5e for that matter. One thing I do have to say, it's going to be hard to see with all of my tabs here, but as you can see, my book doesn't close, and I don't know if that's just this version. I know it has nothing to do with how XO Club stored it. I know that has nothing to do with it because he stored his stuff immaculately. Everything was great. I think that this book is just bound weird, so it doesn't close flat unless you apply a ton of pressure, which is quite strange. But anyway, we're not here to talk about the binding. We're here to talk about the contents of the book. Now, we're unfortunately going to have to deal with the fact that I don't have a digital copy of this, so I can't just show you them. I have to hold them up to the camera. But there's tons of stuff in this book. That's the wrong hand. There is. Up here, you will learn about a magic store, and you can put that in any setting you want, but it is the store that these guys run. And then you learn about mana and mana sites, which is something you can apply to your campaign. It is not like a default feature of 5e, but you can apply it. Then you have a whole bunch of spellcasting options. There's tons and tons of magic items. Where's the camera? This is so hard in reverse, you have no idea. There's spells, and then there's arcane secrets, and there's a little bit of a bestiary at the end. It's not very big, but it's there. The vast majority of the art in this book is super cute minimalist stuff, and it's adorable. It fits the setting. If you'd like to learn about or add the Gemhammer & Sons themselves to your campaign, you totally can, because there's a little bit of a, here you go, this is who they are, this is what they've been doing. You don't have to, though, because, hey, this is homebrew stuff. You can put in whatever you want. You get a whole layout and a clerk and a bunch of stuff that they sell in their store if you want to add their store to your campaign. But you don't necessarily have to. You can just do whatever you want. It doesn't have to be through them specifically. There are tons and tons and tons of magic items in here. The whole first section of the book is magic items. While I think that is super cool, some of them, because they are set in this book, in this universe, you'll need to add all of the features of the Gemhammer Grimoire, like the mana sites and stuff, which we'll get to in a little while. You'll have to add all those, and I don't think a lot of people are going to, because of some of the problems that come up if you do. Some of the complications and abilities that you would get are out of balance, which we will get to in a little bit as well. But a lot of the magic items in this book in particular, the issue with them is that they're rare or above rarity, and they basically almost always end up being some crazy late game item that has some effect or something that a starting party wouldn't have, maybe tier 1 and 2. If you're very, very lucky, you'd run into. So bear that in mind. A lot of the magic items are not for beginning your campaign with. The most logical place to get pretty beginner items is actually the artifact bargain bin table, which is hilarious. It's just really easy peasy basic items that you could probably give to starting out adventurers. And you can even build your own using the random tables here. There are a lot of little flavor text boxes here and there. Not even just the "it's horrible," but a lot of them are from the perspective of, up here, a lot of them are from the perspective of the Sons being what the hell did Dad do? We gotta fix this up. This is a PR nightmare. But one thing I will say is I don't think they had a professional editor go through this book before it went to print, because there are tons and tons of misspellings and grammatical errors. Listen, nobody's perfect, okay? I'm not faulting you for that. There's nothing in here that I just didn't understand because there were so many errors. Some of them I've had to read a couple times to be like, what did you mean? But it's still pretty intelligible. If you happen to be running a campaign or playing in a campaign where it is more likely that you'll be using spell components instead of just a magic focus that basically does everything for you, obviously unless something in there costs money that you need the component for. There are so many magic item options or other thing that are basically replacements for spell components. And I think that is a very neat idea that they run with a lot in this book. Like, use this instead of what you would normally use to either change some aspect of the spell or just being like, oh, this is a much easier option. Maybe it'll backfire, but it's a simpler, more easily obtainable item that you could get in order to cast certain spells. That's a neat touch. That being said, I'm all about, yo, take this magic focus, bro. Just go do your thing. We don't need to worry about you running your component pouch. That's just inventory management we don't need. Okay, a big portion of this book is the idea that mana and mana sites exist, wherein there's just an overabundance of a color of mana. And sort of like materia, that colored mana gives creatures and other things abilities related to the element that is tied to that color. And that being said, like, you can add this to your world, that there are spots in the world, kind of like Pokemon type things, where like there's a biome that exists that is fueled. It is just over encumbered with a certain color mana, and it gives all the creatures in that area some aspect of the elemental ability of that mana. But that also means they're using mana as a sort of consumable resource. So there's some other things tied into that you might not want to add to your campaign. Like, there's a feature in this book. It is a feat, and it is something that can happen to your character where basically they either become addicted to mana, where they really, really need it to survive, or they suffer like terrible withdrawal symptoms, or you can become a creature that is made of pure anti-mana, and it basically makes you immune to being targeted by any kind of magic in the world, which will cause so many problems if you're running a regular baseline 5e game. This is definitely one of those features that you would have to start your campaign telling people about. You can't really add that in because it's going to change everything. If it can happen to multiple people, if it can happen to anyone, that is something that changes the basis of your whole world. The feat is actually called Supremely Ungifted. And ungifted is someone who cannot use mana. And not even in like the way that Rock Lee can't use chakra, so he only uses taijutsu. No, like literally mana cannot touch them. It can't even be used on them. Supremely Ungifted definitely changes the way everything's going to work in your world, and I don't recommend just sliding it into a campaign that's already running, unless it's going to become a thing. If it's just going to be one guy, don't confuse your players like that. But there's this idea that also kind of like Pokemon, you can go around the world trying to find mana beasts. Like whatever beast within that mana site has been completely suffused with that colored mana and is now like a world boss. Like you could basically turn it into, instead of gym leaders, you're going around beating the mana beasts. You have to defeat them in order to purify the mana or something like that. So that could be your whole campaign. Now, this book also has a whole bunch of subclasses built into it. There's 2 subclasses for Bard, Cleric, Druid, Paladin, Ranger, Sorcerer, Warlock, and Wizard in this book. Okay, we're going to get into something here because we haven't gotten into the spells section yet, just the components section. But within these, there are things in here that are wildly unbalanced. I don't know how much playtesting went into things. We're going to get into this more when we get to the spells. But some of these subclasses, you got to be like, huh? Why would you think this would be... Who would take this besides it being a joke? Like, they have a muscle wizard. Hilarious. But the muscle wizard spells that it gets are either way too powerful or way too weak. And that is a theme with the spells in this book that we will get to eventually. I'm just going to show you the muscle wizard because muscle wizard makes me giggle. Look at him! He's big, he's burly. Also, to counter the muscle wizard, the other option for wizards is nomomancy, which is basically, hey, you're using math. You're basically Quandrix, okay? You're using math. But one of their abilities is that they just have built-in counterspell. Just automatic built-in counterspell. And that is so strong. That is so wildly strong. One thing that is super cool is they have a sorceress origin in here that is Fey bloodline. And it is more than just a sorceress origin, because as Fey bloodline, you actually choose who your Fey ancestor is that gave you powers. And you get 3 different choices. So this is basically 3 subclasses all built into one subclass. You're choosing one, and then you get the abilities of one of those 3 options, which is something I don't think I've ever seen. Like, it's subclasses within a subclass sort of deal, where there's Dryad, Hag, or Sprite, and they each give you different abilities. I've never seen that. That's super cool that they can cram all 3 of them in together. For the Sorceress Origins and Sorcerer in general, in addition to the subclasses, there's also a whole new bunch of metamagic feats, and there's a whole new bunch of Warlock invocations that were added because of the Warlock subclasses, or that would be useful to them, which is also super cool. Like, it's just extra stuff they didn't have to include, but they did anyway. A lot of them ended up in the repository, so if you're a YouTube member or you're a patron on Patreon, you can look at them and you can be like, hey, you wrote that you have this printed out, why don't you tell us about it? And then that'll end up an episode of DM Roundtable. So yeah, put it in. Go look. For you paladins and clerics out there, there's an entirely new pantheon in this book that you could add to your world or have them be trying to infiltrate your world. With a new pantheon, you have all sorts of new weird powers, but as long as they're worshipped within the domain, and I'm using domain not as in like a cleric's domain, but within like that plane of existence, you can still get power from them. So there's a whole new pantheon you could add or not add. You can even change some of the titles or filter them in as lesser deities within another god's domain that already exists in your world. You don't have to use them as is. This book also has a new take on prestige classes. So normally prestige classes are like, oh, you got to the highest possible level that you could in a campaign, but you want to get even stronger. So you take on prestige classes. The way that this book interprets prestige classes is that they are classes that you cannot start in. You can only multi-class into them. So you start as one of your regular base classes, and then you can multi-class into them. The prestige classes here, you have Anti-Magic Scion, Chronomancer, Cleromancer, Rat King, and Wall Builder. The Wall Builders are like an absolutely perfect faction just to build. Like a bunch of people who make sure that the right things get done in the world. And they build their walls and they break them down when they need to. I personally wouldn't run any of these classes, any of the prestige classes in this book as prestige classes in my world, but the idea behind each of them would each make for a very interesting faction within your world, at least in my opinion. The Chronomancer prestige class has an ability that I've seen in other races before, homebrew races, where like, hey, if you die, maybe a different version of you from a different timeline comes in and takes your place and still has some of your stats, but maybe slightly different. The Chronomancer has an ability where they can just grab a magic item as long as it's a lower rarity than the highest rarity magic item that they have. Literally any magic item ever. And that I hate. I would not give a player that power. There would be way too much skullduggery and chaos going on for me to allow a player to do that. So probably not going to let a Chronomancer play in a campaign of mine. But again, none of these prestige classes really make sense to me to add to a campaign that I happen to be running. Cleromancer would be great just to use their abilities to divine the future and divine other things as just a group of clerics going around the world doing stuff. I think that the abilities here for drawing cards and or rolling dice are a little complicated, especially for my players. But if you have some NPCs in the world who are doing that, and maybe one of your players could pick it up, maybe not as a class, but just as that one feature, that would be pretty cool. And now I'm here to talk to you about the spells in this book. There are tons and tons of spells here. I'm saying like pages and pages and pages of spells. But that doesn't necessarily mean all of them are good. This is incredibly difficult to do from behind the book. A lot of the spells in here, like I said, they need their wording tweaked to make more sense. There's plenty of times where, even on DM Roundtable, we've come across spells or supplements where we've been like, oh, we think you should have put this portion here in the front that you put in the back because it makes more sense to explain it before you go into detail on it. It's not so much wording like that. It's like they didn't copy the wording scheme that spells have by default in 5e, so it makes them more difficult to discern their actual features for. Plus the spelling and grammatical errors. Some of these spells I also think could just be feats. Like, for example, there's a cantrip in here called Break Concentration, and basically your character just goes, ah! And that makes everyone who's concentrating on a spell roll a concentration save. I think instead, you could just make that a feat that your character has. Like, he has some kind of bellow that disrupts magic. I don't think that necessarily has to be a cantrip. Because if they're doing it every time, it just, I don't know. It just doesn't seem like something that I'd want someone to be able to do every turn when they could be doing something else. I think it just functions better gameplay-wise as if your character's like, oh no, we're getting destroyed out here. Ah! And that gets them out of... It might get them out of their terrible situation. Not that every turn they're just walking over and their whole turn is just ah, 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 ah. Like we don't need that. One weird thing though, this supplement doesn't refer to thunder damage as thunder damage. It always refers to it as sonic damage, which is weird because it's always been thunder damage in 5e. There are a lot of spells in here that are dealing with dream manipulation, which is entirely cool. And I think that a lot of those I would tie into if you took the race Chromelian, which we've gone over in DM Roundtable and is in my D&D homebrew repository. I would probably be like, yo, you should check out these dream spells because this makes sense for your character. I think that's cool. It is a very underutilized niche of spellcasting. My big qualm with the spells in this book is, again, they're very unbalanced. Like, there are some that are so incredibly weak, and then there are some that are just like, did you even look at the spells that were of this level? So a bunch of them need tweaks. In my repository, if there were spells that had easy tweaks, I added them to the repository and I put in what the tweaks were. But some of them I'm just like, how could you possibly have thought that this was an okay choice? There's an entire subgenre in this book of spells that are related to dragons. Just anything, either dragons or dragon-blooded. So if you're a dragonborn or whatever that is, happens to be in your world. Maybe you could even say lizard folk and stuff like that. There's a whole wealth of spells in this book for those kind of people. But most of them are garbage. And if you don't have any dragon's blood in your veins, they have a lesser version of themselves. Like, they just work worse. And the worse version of them, it's absolutely atrocious. I understand saying, hey, if you've got dragon blood in your veins, cool, this is a spell for you. But the fact that the spell is not even good for the dragon-blooded folks, and it's even worse for non-dragon-blooded folks, why would any player want to take these? The absolute worst offender in this book is this 8th level spell, Draconic Spirit. Concentration. For 1 hour, you have +5 AC. There's another spell in this book that is 4th level and also does the same exact thing. But, Draconic Spirit, don't worry. If you've got dragon blood in your veins, during that hour, you ignore resistance to your dragon's elemental affinity. And if a creature has immunity, it drops down to resistance for an hour. Awful. Who's wasting an 8th level spell slot on that? Come on, man. And then there's another section of spells, which I'm assuming Gemhammer and Sons must have run a thing on Twitter at one point. But there's a whole section of spells that are just suggestions from Twitter. They call them Spells of the Generator. And they refer to Twitter as that thing that, bird tweets and stuff deliver all the messages, which is kind of cute. Where these I was expecting to be the unbalanced ones, but it's mostly the Gemhammer and Sons ones that are more unbalanced than the Twitter suggested ones. The final spell section, though, are epic spells. And epic spells in this world are pretty much 10th or higher level spells. And while I would never give one of my players one of these, and they even say in here in the flavor text, like, yo, most of these are going to ruin the world or the area that they're cast in. So probably you don't want to give them to just everybody. If you're within the Forgotten Realms, people don't have 10th level spells anymore because the gods were like, whoa, what are y'all doing down there? And they limited it down to 9. But the epic spells here, I think the vast majority of them make for reasons why your campaign is starting. Like, your bad guys or good guys are trying to make themselves gods, and they'll do whatever it takes to make that happen. Think of the Dead 3. Somebody wants to bring back the previous civilization. They use de-extinction, which is one of the epic spells. There's even one for Thanos in here. Inevitable end. You snap your finger, half of all life dies. Like, some of these, mass domination, someone has taken over a country by controlling the minds of everyone in government all at once. Create or destroy immortality, that's your whole thing. You're trying to stop a lich. You have to take away their immortality. I think a lot of these, more so than giving your players these at the end, raise all dead. Everything comes back. Everything comes back. Time vortex. You're working with your team to make sure that you can go back in time to fix something that went wrong. You're quantum leaping it. And then there's a section that I think is actually pretty cool and probably pretty useful for advanced familiars. So basically what they've done is they've kind of given them a Pokemon-like treatment where each of the familiars can basically evolve when you get a feat. You'll get a new power-up. There also are new forms in here, but you'll get a power-up to them. And then there's another feat that builds off that first feat, and they evolve again. So basically, your familiars will sort of kind of level up with you. They like evolve and change forms as you're playing the game, which makes sense because, let's face it, when you're like level 20 and your familiar's still doing the things that it did at level 1, it feels like you never got any better. Like, it doesn't feel like it was there with you on the journey. I think this makes sense. I might not even keep this as a feat. It might be like something happened within game where your familiar did something really special. Well, it's time to upgrade its form. Speaking of feats, there are tons of feats in this game. Again, some of them are like the spells where they're wildly unbalanced. They're either way too powerful or way too weak. But a whole bunch of them did make it into my D&D repository. So if you're a YouTube member or a patron on Patreon, you'll get access to that. And you can ask me about them. And then we can make a DM Roundtable episode. Oh, my favorite one by far, new favorite feat ever, is Wizard's Beard. You grow a beard that you can will to get longer or shorter or pop in whenever you want. It has an AC of 20 and 20 hit points, and it is almost unbreakable. Obviously, the AC 20 and the 20 hit points, it will grow away. It will go away. It will grow away, yeah. The next day, you could just grow it back. The shenanigans you can create with this. I love that you have to be at least a 10th level wizard to really gain your wizard's beard. But the idea is crazy. The final section of the book is a small appendix with creatures and templates. A lot of the creatures in here are related to the mana beasts, like whatever the basic enemy that's going to appear within that flooded mana sites area. I don't mean flooded by water, though it could if it's the water elementals, but water mana. I mean flooded as in there's so much mana in the mana site. You have the bright bees who can do radiant damage because they're bees infused with, I think it's white mana is light. You have berg bears, they do ice damage, that kind of thing. And by ice damage, I mean cold damage. But the cool thing is there's also a new ability in here for spell scribes, which are people who can just write down spells, which is kind of cool. The very last things that are in here are 2 creatures that are specific to spells in the book. Wombat Bodyguard is something that you can summon to just take a hit, and then he basically always says, I was so close to retirement. And then you have Xavier the Llama, who, when you summon him for a spell, he comes in and plays music, and it makes everybody chill because he's playing a pan flute somehow without, being able to like have opposable thumbs. But he's so cool, you just want to see him again. So his stat block is here, and that was Gemhammer and Sons Grimoire. If you want to add mana sites to your campaign, so places where one kind of mana, one element is overflowing in a biome, if you want to run a campaign where you got to go purify those sites, go stop these mana beasts, go fight those enemies of certain elements and what have you, this is a good book. This will help you with that. The spells in here, again, cool, but wildly unbalanced in some portions. A lot of the spells are either way too weak or way too strong for their level. And again, you could go in and tweak all of them if you wanted to, but you don't have to. The class options are pretty cool, but the prestige classes, I don't really see anyone running them, at least the way that they're intended. I think they all function better as factions and like what the specific NPCs of those factions do than they do like a class that you want to multi-class into. You don't want to... They do get some cool abilities, but you're also not expecting to go very far in them. Like, you're not going to go your whole game to the end to get their powers. And they're not built that way either. They end their abilities like somewhere pretty low, all things considered. Because you are burning big slots, essentially, of like your ability to reach the end of your current class and get like your capstone ability. But if you guys liked what you saw, leave a like. If you want to see more content like this, sub, and I will see you players of all classes later in the next one. Now, I'm not saying anybody has to do this, but if you can support monetarily, you can become a YouTube member or a patron on Patreon. I would suggest not doing both because you're going to get the same rewards. If you become a YouTube member, though, you do get the added bonus of seeing all of my videos uploaded early. And Discord special access so we can chat about them before the general public sees them, if you're into that kind of thing. Otherwise, you get basically the same rewards. My upload schedule, depending on tiers, you get access to the D&D Homebrew Repository, which a lot of the stuff we talk about on DM Roundtable goes in there, but I add plenty of stuff to it in the background. Like everything from here, I've added in the background. We haven't talked about in an episode of DM Roundtable. You also get access to my overhauled BGM list. We may not share the same physical or digital library of music. There are so many ways to get access to all the songs. That being said, I've got them all cataloged for when you can use them, what type of biome you'd be using them in, what setting, and then reasons to use them. So you get access to that. Among other perks here and there. You'll also get some emotes and some other stuff if you become a YouTube member. So yeah, if you can support, feel free to do that. If not, always remember that there are plenty of other ways to support, because pretty much whenever you do...
Come on, push the button!
Yeah, come on, push the button!
Hey, it's going to help, even if it's just liking and subscribing and you're not giving to me monetarily. Again, not forcing anyone to do it, but if you want to, it helps me out. And I can make more videos like this, get more stuff like this.